All right, welcome to our final lecture, History of Life on Earth. So, let's start at the beginning. What happened before the Earth? Well, according to cosmologists, the universe is roughly about 13.8 billion years old. Now, it likely started, and we figured this out looking at the rate at which galaxies are moving away from each other. And so, if we just take that rate and extrapolate it backwards until everything is touching, then it's 13.8 billion years. And so if you can imagine all of the energy in the universe compressed into one tiny little space, you can imagine that's a lot of energy and not a lot of space. Um, so the wave fields of the particles that were involved in that space, I mean, this is like pre-universal particles, so who knows what those were like, but it was a uniform wave function. There was no anomalies. And then suddenly an anomaly came that altered the wave function and created a chain reaction, not so much unlike a nuclear bomb exploding, that caused space and time as a dimension to stretch. And so what this did was it created relative differences in three-dimensional space between objects and matter. And this also gave the energy that was contained in that tiny amount of space somewhere to go, and it expanded outward. And so at this point, the universe was pretty much orderly. There was no, even though it was expanding and there was some anomaly that caused it to expand, everything was uniform as far as like where the energy was clustered. But then at some point there was anomalies in those waveforms, and they created pockets of matter that were closer together than other pieces of matter. And so it was sort of like a chain reaction where you get gravity is pulling in the smaller particles in until you get a massive amount of energy in one space, and that's sort of like the center to a galaxy that we see today. Um, and then, of course, like, you know, as that thing moves through space and time, it swirls and spirals and then collects other stars and other bits of gas and debris, and, you know, stars, individual stars form around it, and all that fun stuff. The Milky Way itself, so let's move on to that. The Milky Way itself it's a cannibal galaxy, and so what you can see is this galaxy is the Milky Way, and it's devouring another galaxy. It just happens to like run into it, and then all of that mass and inertia of all that matter moving through space is enough to kind of subordinate this other mass of moving particles and turns it into one of its tails that's spinning. It's just it's it's hard to like fathom what this even is. You know what I mean? It's familiar to us because we see it a lot. On if you ever go somewhere without light pollution, like outside of cities, you'll see how many just incredibly, amounts of stars there are in the galaxy, and also just further out in the night sky. And so we're kind of on one of these tails of the Milky Way. Now, the Milky Way, like I said, it's old. It's one of the oldest galaxies. So 13.6 billion years is what we've traced it back to. It cannibalizes other galaxies. And then one of the early stars in the Milky Way exploded it. There was a supernova, and this happened somewhere around 4.6 billion years ago. And so that explosion, that supernova, sent a shock wave into a solar nebula, which is kind of like a cloud of uniform dust and particles that of high energy. And so this compression, this shock wave compressed that into what we now consider to be our sun. And then also the shock wave of that, just like a galaxy forming, became sort of a spiraling action. And one of the weirdest things about particles in the universe is how they all kind of have this spiral wave function. A wave, if you look at a spiral from the side, it looks just like a wave, and it's kind of freaky. So, anyways, where we go? So that's the formation of our solar system. So the shock wave collapsed the solar nebula. It compressed all that gas and energy. The sun formed, and then all of that gas, clouds, debris, matter, whatever, is swirling around, and pockets of higher density are going to attract pockets of lower density. And then you get the formation of protoplanets from those collisions, and they start to form a consensus. And so, anytime they bump into each other as they're circling around, they kind of like ricochet off or collapse into one another. And eventually you end up with, 8 or 9 celestial bodies circling the central star. And then that's where Earth was formed. So Earth being the third planet back from the sun, that's where we begin our story of Earth's life, early Earth. All right, so this is the Precambrian period of Earth. What I want to do is just orient you really quick to, I wonder why I can't close this down. Anyways, I want to orient you real quick to this graphic feature over here on the right. And the timeline is on the left axis here, on the y-axis, and it's going from 4.6 billion years ago forward through time until you get to the present day. And then what it's done is it's kind of broken apart those periods of time and given them names and designations and stuff. And so what you'll notice is that the further back in time you go, the bigger the stretches of time. And that's just because we don't have a whole ton of evidence of what was happening during those time periods. If we had more evidence, I'm sure that the divisions of time would look more like the more recent ones of the Jurassic, Triassic, and Cretaceous periods. But it's just so long ago. We're basing this on fossil evidence and radioactive carbon dating. So anyways, that's how that's broken up. So super eon, that's what we're going to start with, is the Precambrian period. So there's basically two major histories, right? There was a history of visible life, which is stuff that you can see with your eyes. So think that would be multicellular life. And then there was a period of life where it was invisible, where you could not see it, although it was there. I mean, you could see evidences of it, especially when you talk about the bacterial towers that are by the ocean. And we'll see that in a couple slides. And so you have this division between the two time periods. And like I said, as we get closer to the present moment, the clarity and precision increases. And so we continue on. Sorry, I had to pause it there for a second. And so what we're going to do is we're going to start back at this first time period of invisible life, if you will. And that time period of microscopic life, of invisible life, can be broken down into 3 periods. And they are in order, starting from the first to the latest, was Hadean, Archean, and Proterozoic. So Hadean being the time period where the Earth and Moon were formed, Archean when life was ancient, Archaea means ancient life, Proterozoic, so prototype, so prototypes of animals were forming during that period. And then the Paleozoic is the next period where you actually get animals, what you're familiar with. Okay, so let's start at the Hadean period. The Hadean eon is when the Earth and Moon formed, and there's evidence that it was 2 protoplanets that collided with one another. One of them stuck by close to the other one. If you think about it, our moon has quite a bit of mass, and so it moves water on our planet like the tides. So it's likely that it was circling the sun, that its orbit came into conflict with another protoplanet, they collided, and then one chunk of the original stuck around and orbited. The moon is incredibly important to, I think, the cycles of life that we see, and probably had a great deal to do with how life itself was able to evolve through these cycles of gravitational fields fluctuating. So anyways, at this point, Earth was a molten mass of rock. So there was no way that life could exist right here. You've got volcanic eruptions. The atmosphere was largely volcanic gases and greenhouse gases and stuff like that. But during the Hadean eon, water vapor eventually cooled, eventually it started to rain, and you get a big, large liquid ocean. And so what you have here is you have a very warm planet, and we know about temperature is like a catalyst. And so if you can increase the temperature, you're increasing the free energy of the environment. And so you can form more complex organic compounds. And so it's almost like the heat of the early solar system was a catalyst and fuel for how life was actually able to draw energy in to complete these complex reactions in this primordial soup of life. And so nothing living yet, but just organic compounds. Now, the Archean eon is one where we start to see the replication of organisms. We start to see in the fossil record these stratoliths of these bacteria that are formed, and you can see like there's these orangey yellow rings around this warm pool of probably acidic water, and this would be sort of your extremophiles and your prokaryotes living on the edges of the ocean. And consider this, right? The ocean is coming in and out with the tide, and so you get these cycles of water moving back and forth and back and forth. In this time period, there was no oxygen. It was obviously just greenhouse gases from all the volcanic eruptions. We do see the formation of polymers like RNA, and so RNA was likely the first molecule, self-replicating molecule on this planet. And so once you get a molecule that can self-replicate, that can duplicate itself, it can withstand mutation. Its descendants can withstand mutation and changes. Eventually, if there are other self-replicating molecules that are able to read some of the code from other self-replicating molecules and turn that code into something functional for themselves, you can get proteins. And so this Archean eon is basically when life was starting to figure out how to replicate and divide. And this is when ancient life begins. No nucleus, no organelles, just one compartment in a cell containing the reactants that are self-replicating, like RNAs and proteins and stuff. The first fossils of prokaryotes were found 3.7 billion years ago. And so that's when we attribute the beginning to life to be, is about 3.7 billion years ago. Next slide. All right, so the next period, so this is Proterozoic. This is the prototypes of animals are forming, animals and plants, during this time period. So the Proterozoic eon was when these early cells really started to compartmentalize some of the reactions. We see the first eukaryotic cells show up on the fossil record, and then later organelles like the chloroplast and mitochondria evolve. So photosynthesis had to evolve first, and then the organelle. And the reason why is that the mitochondria and chloroplast come from ancient prokaryotes. One of them, the mitochondria, was able to take metabolites of glucose and further oxidize them into carbon dioxide and water, but at the same time be able to generate large amounts of ATP. And so an ancient eukaryotic organism swallowed one of these prokaryotic organisms, and instead of digesting it, just kept it inside itself. And through a process called endosymbiosis, these two organisms basically grew into one organism. The same thing for the chloroplast. It was a photosynthesizing prokaryote that was swallowed by a eukaryotic organism, and that eukaryotic organism that swallowed the chloroplast already had evolved with the mitochondria. And so all plants have a mitochondria and a chloroplast, whereas all animals have just a mitochondria. And so we know the ancient animals swallowed the mitochondria first, the ancient eukaryotic cell. It became endosymbiotic with it, and then one of its descendants swallowed a chloroplast and was able to not only produce vast amounts of sugar from just sunlight and carbon dioxide, but it was also able to take that sugar and break it down further and oxidize it with the mitochondria to get tons of ATP. And so what you see here is organisms like eukaryotes are able to start capitalizing on the energy resources in their environment to the nth degree. So I think this is, and this is just my personal opinion, I think that had to happen first. Like the mitochondria and chloroplast had to come by endosymbiosis before there was ever even a chance at multicellular life. Because multicellular life is so energy dependent, you have to be able to develop these are the prerequisites you need to develop in order to support the large energy requirements of multicellular life. And so we first see these multicellular organisms right after this start to evolve. And it's like, okay, yeah, they were probably dependent on those energy sources from photosynthesis and the mitochondria. And then once you have this large explosion of organisms that are highly adapted to their environment because they're able to pull energy out of the sun out of the air and turn it into sugar and metabolize that sugar. Once you had that happen, and the byproduct of that was oxygen gas. So in the previous eon, in the Archean eon, there was no oxygen gas. Once the chloroplast evolved and photosynthesis evolved, the atmospheric composition was forever changed, because now you have a large proportion of oxygen showing up in the atmosphere, and that killed off a lot of organisms. And so that vacuum that was left behind by those other organisms is what led us to the next stage in the history of life. And so this forms a line right here. This line marks the end of invisible life, right? The microscopic life. And it starts the explosion of visible or macroscopic life and its rapid diversification. And so that's what's happening here. This line marks this transition of the atmosphere to where it has a large component of it is now oxygen. In fact, the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere starting in the Cambrian period was about twice as much as it is today. If you were to go back then, you would feel like you were like, whoo, you were like had one of those oxygen bars like injected into your veins, be pumped up, you have tons of energy. And what's interesting about that is that that's why a lot of the organisms early on in Earth's life were so large, because they had this massive amount of oxygen proportion in the atmosphere fueling their mitochondria. That's why you have huge insects and stuff like that. Okay, anyway, so we're looking at the next stage. So we're looking at the Phanerozoic eon of life. And so this is going to be broken down into 3 periods. The Paleozoic, or I say period, sorry, it's going to be broken down into 3 eras. The Paleozoic era, the Mesozoic era, and the Cenozoic era. And what we see in these 3 periods, or these 3 eras, is we see the incredible diversification of animals and plants, but also of fungi. I didn't put that on there, but it's just really because fungi get ignored. They don't move. You know, they're not like they're not interesting to watch like animals. And they're kind of mundane looking. They're not as beautiful as plants, so to speak. Like they don't have as many colors, and we don't typically eat them as often as we do plants, and so we typically leave them alone. But the fungi are a huge component to the evolution of animals and plants, because they are the decomposers of the world. They are what break down organic material and recycle it for the rest of us. And so anyways, during these sorry, I keep saying periods, but during these eras, this is when we see like the pre-dinosaur era. That's the Paleozoic. So the Paleozoic is before the dinosaurs, basically. So this is when life is going through its diversification and starting to move from the ocean onto land. And then we see the Mesozoic is where the dinosaurs lived, and that's sort of what you're familiar with, you know, all the big reptiles. And then the Cenozoic is after the dinosaurs died off. That's kind of the ascension of mammals on this planet, where you get the rapid diversification of mammals. But we're going to start right here with the Cambrian period, about 544 million years ago. And this is where we start, Cambrian. So I just want to touch on this before we continue on the Cambrian. So roughly 544 million years ago, something dramatic happened. Life began to take on a new form of complexity. That would be multicellularity. The Phanerozoic eon, although this only represents, if you do the math, it only represents the last 12% of life's time here on the Earth. It contains within it the richest part of life's evolutionary history. And so we started the Cambrian period. During the Cambrian period, so this is when the rate of adaptive radiation and diversification was so massive. On the scale of the diversification of this was just astronomical. And one of the reasons for that, what we think, is that it was the duplication and then specialization of developmental genes in the multicellular creatures. And so you get a gene that's about 180 base pairs long, and it codes for a transcription factor that switches on a part of the genome that codes for like a ligament or a limb, like an arm or a fin or something like that. And so anytime you duplicate that gene, you get a whole nother limb that grows. And so you get these diversifications, or you get the duplication and then specialization of these genes that grow different parts of bodies. And so this was nature's like giant experimental chamber, so to speak, was the Cambrian period. And what we see is we see all the major body plans, sponges, annelids, worms, mollusks, arthropods, vertebrates. We see all of these major body plans evolve in this tiny, like 50 million period time of life. And so you see all of the major animal phyla are formed during that time period. And then also this is the time period where vertebrates and invertebrates kind of diverge from each other. And what's interesting is that, you know, everything starts as a single cell, but when it goes through massive amounts of duplication, you end up with a giant ball of cells. And what forms the first cavity in that giant ball of cells will either be the mouth or the anus. So it infolds on itself and creates exactly what you would think. It creates like a little invagination, like a cavity. And so what's interesting about the vertebrates and invertebrates is that that first stage in development, that infolding, will either be the mouth or the anus, and that's what determines whether you're a vertebrate or an invertebrate. Just fun fact. What came after the Cambrian period was the Ordovician period. And so this is the time that life was really abundant and it was beginning to prosper and diversify in the oceans. The terrestrial land outside of the water was pretty much bare. There was no plants, there was no animals, but the seas were teeming with life. Plants did begin to settle on swampy land around the coast, so we start to see some of the non-vascular plants like mosses and liverworts in the fossil record, but nothing too far inland. Everything out of the water needed the water to be around them all the time to survive and reproduce, and so they weren't very complex. Now, the Ordovician period is marked by a massive glaciation event. And so anytime you suck up the water from the oceans into these giant glaciers, the ocean levels drop. And so all of those environments that were previously underwater are now out of the water. They dry out. The animals that can't adapt go extinct. And so there was a mass extinction at the end of the Ordovician period. Right after the Ordovician period, you get the Silurian period where the Earth warms back up, the ocean levels rise, things become more tropical. Now that the ocean levels come back up, those once non-vascular plants evolve a new feature, which is vascular tissue. And so plants are actually able to start growing taller and taller, getting closer and closer to the sun, competing for sunlight for photosynthesis. And so we start to see plants grow taller and taller during this time period due to the vascular tissue. Like I said, the sea levels are rising. We did find some arachnid and centipede fossils during this time period on land. There wasn't a lot, but this is about the time that terrestrial arthropods probably started to experiment with terrestrial life, basically. All right. All right. The Devonian period is very, very special to vertebrates because it's the first time that vertebrates were actually able to move from the ocean onto land. So before the Devonian, you had invertebrates like insects. They were able to move out of land. But the big guys, the guys with bones, they stayed in the oceans for a lot longer. But this is a time period where some vertebrates, some terrestrial vertebrates, were able to move from the ocean onto land. Inside of the ocean, fish were going through a huge period of diversification. A lot of them were jawless fish. They didn't have jaws, and they had armored scales and stuff. They were very ancient, very ugly looking fish. Very, very diverse types of fish as well. And so we call this the age of the fish. But it's the first time that tetrapods were able to move onto land. So tetrapods mean having four limbs. Tetra, four, pods, foot. And so four-footed creatures, like think about everything that's on land now that has four limbs. You know, your crocodiles, your humans, your oh my God, I'm drawing blanks. Sheep, you know, man. Birds, reptiles, mammals. So all these four-limbed creatures all came from an ancient lobe-finned fish that somehow made its way out of the water onto land. And what likely was the evolutionary pressure for that was the environment was shifting. The deeper seas were starting to thin out and become more shallow. And so these lobe-finned fish had to start scuffling on the bottom of the seabed looking for their food. We've seen some of their prints in the mud where they were scuffling with their fins. Invertebrates, like we said, were settling into terrestrial environments, and wood was starting to evolve, like lignins. So things, consider that plants are 100% dependent upon the sun, and so they're in an endless cycle of competition to grow taller and taller to try to reach as high as they can to get closer to the sun and be less shaded than other plants around them. The Devonian time period ended with a mass extinction, so we see a big extinction event. Nobody quite knows why. But during the Devonian period, I want to bring this to your attention. So I'm going to go into a little bit more depth on why this tetrapod transition onto land was so important, and what one of the biggest discoveries of the last 20 years was. In 2006, we only had suppositions about lobe-finned fish and their connection to land vertebrates. We had two members of, here, I'm going to use my pointer. We had two members in the fossil record. 380 million years ago, we had this lobe-finned fish in the fossil record. And we're like, okay, that's cool. It's got a humerus bone, a radial, and an ulna, and maybe some distal elements here of the wrist. But it was mostly fin with some bones. And then later on we in the fossil record, just 20 million years later or so, we find Acanthostega, which is a land-dwelling amphibian, which obviously like still swam in the waters, probably laid its eggs in the waters. And it did not have any fin elements. It did have lots of little bones in its toes, like it had lots of toes, but it didn't have any fins. And so we had no link between this bony fin fish and this other land-dwelling vertebrate that showed us that there was an organism that lived and walked both on its fins and swam in the ocean. So we're looking for something that could walk on its fins. And then in 2006, this gentleman discovered the missing link, this Titaic rosea, a tetrapod-like fish in the evolution of the tetrapod body plan. And what he found, Neil Shubin found, was he found this Titaic rosea. And what he noticed was he's an anatomical paleontologist, and he was able to note that the shoulder sockets in Titaic were rotated forward, unlike his ancestor where they were up and down. They were oriented for up and down movement. His were oriented for forward and back rotation, showing that his arms actually went like this. And he had fins on the end of his fingers, and so it was the missing link. It was really cool. Okay, so that was when tetrapods transition onto land. Now, the Carboniferous period is the time when terrestrial environments were starting to diversify both for plants and animals, and that's because everything had now transitioned, right? There was no more organisms that were going to move or make the evolutionary jump from water to land. So now everything on the land is going to evolve based on terrestrial environments, and everything in the water is pretty much going to stay in the water and just evolve in the aquatic environment. And during the Carboniferous period, there was large tropical forests all over the planet. And the problem with this was that the specialized decomposers of wood had not yet evolved. I mean, we had bacteria and fungi, but they hadn't evolved the enzymes to break down cellulose in the plant, this woody material. And so this woody material, as the plants died, it would just build up over millions and millions of years. I mean, and this is what made all the oil fields, was all of the dead plant material that couldn't be decomposed during this time period is what makes up all the fossil fuels that we use today. During this time period too, a huge evolutionary jump happened when organisms were able to lay their eggs on land. Before, they were working amphibiously, so they would lay their eggs in the water, their eggs would develop and then slowly come back onto land and probably just mate on land, lay eggs in water, and eventually they made it out to where organisms were just able to lay their eggs on land, and so the amniotic egg developed. And so this completed the life cycle of the vertebrate in the terrestrial environment. Now it mated on land, it hunted on land, and it laid its eggs on land. Okay, the next period is the end of this era, the Permian period. So this is when Pangea is forming. So all before this, the ancient continents were coming together to form Pangea. Pangea forms during this time period, and because it's such a large landmass with probably lots of mountain ranges around its exterior, the inner part of the continent dries out and the desert lands start to form. And what that did was it forced trees to come up with a new way of reproduction without water. Because previous to this, the only way they could reproduce was by dropping their seeds in water and being able to reproduce in water. But now that the land is dried out, it forced them to come up with new ways, evolve new ways of dispersing their seeds. And so this was the first time where plants were able to enclose their embryo in a hard outer case called a seed. And this is where we get gymnosperms, the conifers, the cone trees. And they also began to use wind as a form of reproduction. And so if you've ever seen male and female pine trees, the male pine trees have those tiny little looking green pine cones on them. When the wind blows, all this yellow pollen and dust comes out. That's just essentially tree sperm blowing in the wind. And then the bigger cone trees pick up that pollen, and the sperm meets the egg forms a shell, and you end up getting a seed in these pine cones. And so it was the first time we see that, with the wind dispersal and no water needed for reproduction. The Permian period also, you get, this is the evolution of like your ancient reptilian crocodile-like species. You know, this is where the fins had all fallen off, the lizardy-like reptilian scales had evolved from fish scales to make them more adapted for the terrestrial environment. And at the end of this time period, there was a huge mass extinction, and nobody knows exactly why, but it wiped out about 95% of all species on the planet. It was the Great Dying, is what they call it. And so that ends the Paleozoic era. And so that was the pre-dinosaur era. Now we're moving into the Mesozoic era. This is where the dinosaurs showed up. Now the first period of the Mesozoic era is the Triassic period. And this is when you can consider maybe your reptile crocodiles, your modern crocodiles, right? They haven't changed in 80 million years, which is terrifying when you look into the eyes of one and it just has this reptilian dead, I'm gonna eat you brain staring back at you. The oceans are teeming with life. You get a lot of those big reptilian creatures that were swimming in our oceans. Now, the few surviving species, anytime you have a mass extinction, there's a habitat vacuum, there's an ecological vacuum where there's all this abundant resource and no organisms to eat it or consume it or live within it. And so there's usually a massive diversification of the surviving species into these new vacant environments. And so that's where we see the dinosaurs really took hold and began their ascension. The armored fish of the Permian period are gone. And so in the fossil record, fish are starting, all the fish have jaws now, and the armors have fallen off. And so they're starting to take on more of the conventional look that you think of when you think of fish. The supercontinent of Pangaea starts to break apart, which starts to change climates. It separates certain species of dinosaurs, but this is when we see the first dinosaurs truly evolve. We do see the first proto-mammal, so this would be an individual where they have maybe thinned out scales or something like that that are starting to look modified in the fossil record, but by no means are mammals anywhere. I mean, they're not prevalent at all in the fossil record. We've found an early one here, but that's probably about when they started to diverge, was early in the Triassic. Now the Jurassic period, that's a totally different story. Now the Jurassic period is your quintessential dinosaur period. It can be broken down into three periods: early, middle, and late, are three time periods: early, middle, and late. So early Jurassic is tropical, super tropical. You get the evolution of three-toed reptiles, hollow-boned reptiles, three toes, called theropods. And they are the ancestors of modern-day birds. During the middle of the Jurassic period, this is the quintessential dinosaur period. This is when you have your Allosauruses, you have your pterodactyls. The T-Rex and the ones you're more familiar with have not yet evolved, even though they're right here. The Allosaurus has 3 fingers. It was there during this time period. Probably looked more like this guy in the middle. And so the middle Jurassic is when we see the first clade of mammals evolve. And so this would be different species of mammals, but they were all rodent-like. They were all they're relatively small. And nocturnal too. Dinosaurs were out during the day. Most of them we believe to be cold-blooded, so relied on the sun for energy to do their reactions. That left a gap in the day, technically night, for mammals to move in and sort of colonize the nighttime, if you will. And so all mammals were nocturnal during the Jurassic period. The large predators, like I said, were Allosaurus, Dilophosaurus. That's that one that spits in the movie Jurassic Park, like and kills Dennis Nedry in the Jeep. Yep. Um, the late Jurassic is the time period when we see feathers start to show up in the fossil record. The continents are further drifting apart, like Africa and South America start to separate during this time period. And so you see dinosaur fossils that in South America that are very similar to the ones in Africa, even though they're separated by an ocean. And so that's some evidence that the continents were together and then drifted apart around this time period. The Cretaceous period is the fun one. Okay, so this is when the planet begins to kind of normalize in its temperate, tropical, desert locations and environments. This is where we see the diversification of feathers on birds start to show up. They start to lose their scaly appearance and start to appear more feathered. This is also when you have like your Velociraptor shows up, your Tyrannosaurus Rex, your Triceratops, your Iguanodon. The tropics, like I said, are reduced to the equator. And then also the Cretaceous period is a huge jump in evolution. Cretaceous period is when plants make this giant jump to evolve flowers and to attract pollinators. And then this is when the coevolution of pollinators, insect pollinators, and angiosperms came around. And so this is your earliest flowering, fruiting plant that encloses its seed within a fruit. Huge plants. And because they had such a huge advantage where they didn't rely on the wind and they didn't have to rely on water to reproduce, they provided a resource and attracted a pollinator and basically worked in symbiosis, well, not endosymbiosis, but in symbiosis with these pollinators, where they were able to tit for tat with them. I'll give you some nectar and then you just spread my pollen to another flower and I'll reproduce. And so that was how they had competitive advantage over the gymnosperms at the time. And that's why they were able to rapidly diversify on the planet during this time period. And we see small mammals are splitting apart and diversifying, but they're staying really small and they are not predatory in the way that dinosaurs were predatory. In fact, I doubt very many mammals ate any reptiles during this time period. At the end of the Cretaceous period, we have the second largest mass extinction in the history of Earth. It's called the KT boundary. It is likely that it was caused by an asteroid collision with the Earth, hopefully one of the last that we'll ever have to deal with. And it essentially changed the entire environment for millions of years, blacked out the sun. Plants died, animals died, a lot of dinosaurs all died. Anything over 22 was it pounds or kilograms died? I think it was 10 pounds, 22 or 10 kilograms or 22 pounds was dead. And so all these small mammals that lived in burrows and holes and were like little scavengers, they survived. But the big lizardy dinosaurs that needed to eat big lizardy herbivores, they were gone. And that brings us into the post-dinosaur. All right, so just after the death of the dinosaurs 65 million years ago, we get the Cenozoic era. The first period in the Cenozoic era is the Paleogene period. And so this is the ascension of mammals. This is the diversification, specialization of mammals. This is also when mammals moved away from being purely nocturnal. So some of the tree-dwelling rodents that became early primates started to come out during the daytime, and because they were using sunlight, they started to recognize when fruit was ripening. They also developed better color vision as some of our early primate ancestors. And so without the dinosaurs around, there was these huge gaps in the ecological column that mammals were able to move in and diversify in. And this is where you see the major diversification of mammals too. So you see the evolution of the canines, the felines, the bears, marsupials, primates, cetaceans are the ones that moved into the ocean. So that would be like your whales and dolphins and hippos moving, right? Rodents, herbivores, so you name it, major mammal groups are evolving. We also see some predatory birds diversify during this time period too. So some of the ones that survived the mass extinction, the KT boundary, diversified and became our modern, what do you call them? Birds of prey, raptors, our modern raptors, our modern birds of prey. So owls, eagles, hawks, and that sort of thing. The next period, the Neogene period, is when grasslands started to expand and they were replacing forests. And so these tall grasslands probably caused some of these tree-dwelling primates to have to come down from the trees to hunt for their food and have to walk through tall grass. So they probably forced them, some of them, to walk upright when they came out of the trees. You see where I'm going with this? This is where 30 known species of apes evolve. And remember that apes are not monkeys. Monkeys have tails. Monkeys swing from trees. Apes have no tails. So chimpanzees are apes. Gorillas are apes. Orangutans are apes. Humans are apes, or belong to the ape tribe, if you will. And this is when we see later on in the Neogene period, parts of modern Ethiopia. We see in some of the fossil beds there during the Neogene period that we find some early upright walking hominids, the most famous of which is Lucy, our Australopithecus, and that was about 2.5 million years ago. During the end of the Neogene period, we see the climate start to go through a cooling event where the glaciers are forming, the ocean levels drop, and these huge land bridges begin to form between continents. And so you see a lot of migration happen during the end of the Neogene, where you get species of elephant and tiger and wolves and things like that. I mean, that's why a lot of them and bears are so prevalent on all continents, is because of these giant land bridges allowed them to spread out and populate all of the continents. And then, like I said, the migration of species. And then the Quaternary period is just before the period that we're in now. So this is from 2.5 million years ago until about 10,000 years ago. So 2.5 million years ago, the climate starts to go through these periods of warming and cooling, glaciation, tropical, back and forth. These cycles of heating and cooling is what carved out like our Grand Canyon. That's what carved out like parts of Sedona. Is these last couple million years have gone through these huge glaciation events and then warming events and glaciation. And so a lot of the modern geography that we see on the planet happened during the last 2 million years. We also see the mammoths, saber-toothed tigers, and dire wolves are incredibly prevalent. Saber-toothed tigers, dire wolves hunting the large woolly mammoths and herbivores that became so prevalent in those grasslands that formed during the last time period. We see that Homo sapiens, the early Homo sapiens or early humans, migrated out of Africa no longer ago than 100,000 years ago. And so sometime in the last 100,000 years, modern humans made the jump from Africa into the northern, cooler European climates and Asian climates. And then the age of the human begins at the end of the Quaternary period after the last ice age ends, because humans had at this point likely colonized the entire planet. They've moved from Africa, spread out. They were incredibly resilient, incredibly clever, brilliant, able to provide for themselves, perhaps even partially agricultural in some ways, some of them nomadic, following the herds. But humans were incredibly resilient, these ancient humans, and diversified and spread across the globe, and were very cunning in how they were able to adapt and do. They weren't acclimating necessarily. I mean, they were, but like they were also covering themselves in clothes to protect their body heat in the colder climates. Some of their skin lightened up to allow for more vitamin D absorption during this time period too. And so we see the age of the human begins about 10,000 years ago. And since then, since the age of the human, we've been undergoing one of the fastest and largest mass extinctions of all time, rivaling that of the great dying of the Permian period. And now in the present day, we have just this incredible global biodiversity that's being threatened with, all kinds of stuff, climate change mostly. But life will continue to adapt. So we're not going to kill the planet. The planet's not going to die. But it's likely we're in a trajectory of like a great dying off. And who knows if it'll be a new version of humans that arises in the next, couple million years, or, if it's something entirely different. The climate change that we're experiencing now is threatening the planet's biodiversity. We do have a lot of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. In fact, like several hundred, I mean, it's like 300 times more carbon dioxide than we've had in our atmosphere since like the Carboniferous period or something. It's something crazy like that. Um, and that obviously like traps heat, warms the planet. And warming planets change ocean currents, change climates, dry certain parts of the deserts out, causes extreme weather. And if the extinction rate that we're seeing now, if the rate continues, if we extrapolate the line that says how fast species are dying off or how many species are dying off every year, then by the year 2100, about half of all of the species on this planet will be extinct. And there's so many questions that we have to face in the next decade or two. What do we do about invasive species, monocropping, GMOs, insecticides, herbicides? We have gene editing programs, CRISPR, massive pollutions and plastic waste building up in oceans, melting glaciers, virus pandemics, civil rights issues, ocean temperature changes, extreme weather patterns, globalization, habitat removal. So there's so much that we have that we need to just take into consideration in the next couple of decades. And the people in college right now are the future of that movement, to see, to see how much effect we can have on this changing environment, on this momentous event that we've already begun unknowingly. There was no way that we were like, oh yeah, let's just start polluting the air and we'll see what happens. It was like we were just oblivious until, maybe 50, 60 years ago. One of the reasons why is because um, before we were able to go into space and turn around and take a picture of our planet, it was just in our brains that the planet was infinite and flat. And so if you have an infinite planet that is flat, you have infinite resource and infinite territory to explore. So if you ruin the environment you're in, you just move on to the next one. But by going into outer space, having the astronauts turn around and snap a picture of the planet, it put everything in perspective. Like that, from that point forward, when astronauts took pictures of our planet and sent them back and everybody was able to look and see, hey, we're all on one globe here, that's when you start to see the environmental movements. People are starting to recognize, wait a second, we have just this one planet hurtling through an infinitude of space, surrounded by a vacuum that would kill us in a heartbeat if we were ever exposed to it. And it's like, okay, we need to start taking what we're doing on this planet seriously, because it will have lasting effects into the future. And so that's kind of where we're at now, with life and where we're going forward. So I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you enjoyed the class too. I'll see you guys later. Best of luck.